So we see that the goals of doctrinal discussions are shaped by at least two main desires: the desire to express the truth, but also the desire to counter falsehood. Now that we have a basic definition of doctrines and systematics, and we've seen the legitimacy and goals of doctrinal discussions, we should turn to the third aspect of our orientation: the place of doctrines in the entire program of systematic theology. In previous lessons, we've seen that from the medieval period, theology was built with four basic steps: the formation of carefully defined technical terms, the creation of propositions, then the formation of doctrines, and finally, a comprehensive system of beliefs. Now, we always have to remember that it's somewhat artificial to speak of these concerns as steps in building theology. Systematicians actually involve themselves in all of these steps all of the time. But it helps to think of the process of building systematic theology as moving from the simplest to the most complex. At the lowest level, theological technical terms comprise the most basic building blocks of systematic theology. Without carefully defined terminology, it would be very difficult to construct sound systematic theology. The second step is the formation of propositions. If we think of technical terms as the basic building blocks of systematics, then we may think of propositions as rows of blocks that use and explain technical terms. And we may describe doctrines as rows of propositions that form portions of walls or whole walls. And finally, the system of theology represents the ways theologians build an entire building out of doctrinal statements. So we see that just as walls are essential to a building, doctrines hold an essential place in the construction of systematic theology. Now that we have a general orientation toward doctrines and systematics, we should move to our second major topic, the formation of doctrines. How do systematicians create the doctrinal discussions that are so vital to their project? When students first begin to study systematic theology, they often have the false impression that doctrines result from little more than piecing together propositional truths from Scripture. To the novice, the entire project often appears to be very simple. But the processes that go into forming doctrines in formal systematic theology are actually quite complex. In fact, they involve so many different factors that a thorough analysis is impossible. Yet we can still gain some insights into the ways doctrines are normally formed in systematic theology. To understand the processes that go into forming doctrines and systematics, we'll look into two topics. First, we'll see the ways systematicians develop biblical support for their views. And second, we'll explore how systematicians employ logic to explain and support their doctrines. Let's look first at biblical support for doctrines. Now, it's always important to remember that systematicians often build their cases philosophically and historically. Who believed what, and when did they believe these things? Were they right? Were they wrong? These kinds of concerns can be very significant at times, especially as systematicians deal with the history of doctrines and try to identify falsehoods that oppose their views. But by and large, the most critical way systematic theologians support their doctrinal discussions is by seeking the support of Scripture. We'll examine biblical support in doctrinal discussions in two ways. First, we'll describe the basic process systematicians follow as they garner biblical support for their outlooks. And second, we'll see an example of this process in systematic theology. Let's consider first the basic process that systematicians follow as they build their case from Scripture. In earlier lessons, we've seen that systematicians begin to handle the Scriptures by subjecting them to factual reduction. they look for the theological facts that biblical passages teach. And as we've also seen, they collate these facts into theological propositions. But as systematic theologians move toward forming doctrines, they go beyond these basic processes toward large-scale synthesis and explanation.